women on average have a carbon footprint from food and transport usage that is 26% lower than men. In this 26% initial gap, what we find is that if you take into account differences between men and women in terms of how often they are employed, differences in where they live, differences in education, differences in their level of income, you can reduce the gap to 18% when you take into account all these factors. And then this 18% is still significant. We also try to take into account factors that have to do with biological differences between men and women. So typically the fact that men need to eat more calorie every day. And when we take this into account, we see that the gender gap for food decreases quite a lot. So this means that really these differences in biological needs explain an important share of the gap in carbon footprints for food. And similarly for transport, if you take into account the fact that on average men travel longer distances, this also decreases the gap quite significantly. So once we take into account these biological differences, like the calories and the transport, the distances traveled for transport, there remains a gap that is around 8%. So it's significantly smaller, but it's still, important. And what's very interesting is that almost everything in this remaining gap can be explained by the fact that men eat more red meat. And red meat, of all the food products that we have in our analysis, it's really the one that is the most polluting, because we know that red meat has a carbon intensity that is, much higher than other types of meat or than fish or than vegetables. And for transport, it's almost entirely explained by the fact that men use the car more, or more specifically that they have higher emissions from car usage. And what's interesting is that these two goods that are very different, red meat and car, it's something that you use for very different purposes, but they're both, from other studies and other research, they're both tied to like traditional masculinity. And so there is other research in social science that shows how indeed it's more important in a way to be a real man, as a cliche of what it means to be a real man, to eat red meat and to have a big car. And so the fact that these two goods explain a lot of the gap that remains once we take into account many other factors, it sort of indicates the potential role of these gender norms as something that isn't going to have environmental consequences.